Fáilte. Welcome to this episode of The Language Question, Ceis na Tongan, a conversation about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about their relationship with it and its role in our identity. Our guest of this episode is Éamonn Ó Dónaill. Éamonn is a native of Gaeltacht in the Donegal Gaeltacht. He is the author of many books, including some of the most important current texts on Irish grammar. He is also a founder of Gaeltacht. As well as giving us his unique take on the language, he highlights something that he says he finds distressing: the crisis in the Gaeltacht and the lack of any real debate on that subject outside of Irish language communities. This is a theme we've seen coming up again and again in these conversations, and I'm sure you'll find Éamonn's perspective on all of that fascinating. I'm delighted to say that we've had some wonderful reviews of the show since we launched. Julic in the UK said in relation to our first episode, "This is a gripping account of the history of the Irish language. It has helped me to understand how most people do not have the ability to speak Irish and the many historical and current reasons for this. The discussion was interesting, dynamic and engaging, and personally I will be eagerly following all future episodes." Thank you so much, Julic, for that wonderful review. I really appreciate it. You may only see the reviews in the country that you're listening in, and therefore I would really appreciate your feedback from whoever you are. I would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your complimentary, valuable learning resources and to ensure that you stay up to date on upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Anyhow, here goes with this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Gumina tú soltas. Hello and welcome everybody. I am joined today by an excellent and wonderful guest who we are extremely privileged to have with us here on the show today. I have Éamonn Ó Dónaill, who is an author and educationalist. He is a native of Gaeltacht in the Donegal Gaeltacht. He worked for a number of years as a director of the Department of Modern Irish's Language Centre in UCD, and then went on to become a founder of Gaeltacht, where he was a director of education for many years and is now chair of the postgraduate degree in translation. He was instrumental in the development of the Irish language learning series Tourist Changa with RTE, and Now You're Talking with RTE and BBC. He's the author of many Irish language learning resources, including Gaeilge gan Stro and Gramadach gan Stro, arguably, in my opinion, the best Irish grammar book for learners currently available. Éamonn a chara tá fáilte is fiúrót an seo, agus is mór an ónóir doing tú a bhelin.
Gur míle maigad tá Anna has bhéin seo.
Well, we're so glad to have you. Éamonn, I'd love if we could maybe start at the beginning in terms of you're a native speaker from the Donegal Gaeltacht. Would you mind telling us your background in the language and how that looked like as growing up before you entered into the educational sphere?
Yeah, well, as you said, I was brought up in Gaeltacht in Donegal, and when I was young in the 60s and 70s, the language was still very, very vibrant, very much the community language. Is under a lot of threat, under a lot of pressure now, as it is in most of the Gaeltacht areas. But at that time, I remember in the Leaving Cert class, there were 22 of us, and 21 were native speakers of Irish. And there was a poor guy there from Glasgow who understood everything and who communicated with us in English, but we just spoke Irish to him. That situation has changed a lot since then. There's a tendency now on the part of Irish speakers to switch to English, even if there's only one person in the company. But that stage was very, very different. I suppose changes started occurring in the area in the late 60s. There was very sudden industrialization, a lot of inward immigration, people who had left earlier in their lives, they returned with children, and in 95% or more of cases, those people coming back spoke only English to their children. So that's one of the complications, one of the reasons why the language is under pressure. So I would have had a lot of interest in Irish, and from a very early age, I had a teacher at secondary school who focused primarily in the teaching of Irish on grammar. Every single person hated that teacher, hated that class except me. I was absolutely, very, very interested in what he had to say, and he really got me interested in grammar at that stage. And then I went to university in Maynooth and partied for 3 years. Early, got a very poor degree actually. Then I decided to do a 1 year master's, which took me 5 years because I really, really, I was enjoying myself a lot. Um, so really, I wasn't very, very focused on work, on anything really, just having a good time. But during my time in Maynooth, I was thrown in at the deep end as regards teaching in 1981 when I was in first year in mid-October. The teacher dealing with the person teaching Ulster Irish left suddenly. She got a master's in another college. And I was told by Pádraig Fianachta, Father Pádraig Fianachta, that I was going to teach. I wasn't asked if I wanted to, but I was actually thrown in uh, at the age of 18 to teach first, second, and third years with no guidelines and not much material available. And for 10 years, I taught very, very badly. For more than maybe 15 years, I was a very, very bad teacher, extremely poor quality classes. Um, then I improved subsequently and became a better teacher after many years of struggling.
Just come back to that for a second, because um, one of the things that you're interested in grammar there. I mean, one of the things we often kind of, I think, that's assumed in the Irish education system is that Irish, because it's kind of, prevalent, or it's our native language over it, that we'll just pick it up, and that you're doing it in the education system for so many years before you even come to secondary school, that so much is assumed in terms of prior knowledge, which in my experience just was never there. But I mean, let's talk about that in terms of you as a native speaker. I mean, you were very fortunate having that teacher you mentioned, I think. But I mean, like that, was it just natural, your ability to teach the language and your interest in the language? Did that come from your native experience?
Yeah, I suppose the interest in the language was due to the fact that I had that teacher. He influenced me very much, but I didn't have a natural ability when it came to teaching at all. Um, and I suppose I understood a lot of the grammatical rules, but I learned a lot of them subsequently after my education when I became editor of Core magazine. um, I spent a period there, 6 months working as sub editor with a highly experienced person. So a lot of my knowledge of grammar, I didn't get it in the education system at all. I got it subsequently, um, and you know I suppose um, it's an advantage definitely that I was a native speaker. That was definitely an advantage, particularly when it came to teaching the language. I understood. I could differentiate something that a lot of people who learn the language can't do. Could differentiate between what was natural, what was native, what was proper Irish. I could differentiate between that and the sort of language that often is taught in school. Um, it might come as a shock to many people, or it might not, but a lot of the language taught in the education system is absolutely incorrect. It's been taught in a certain way for many years. So I had the advantage of being able to distinguish between what was normal, what was natural, what what reflected everyday usage, and then these forms that are often taught. I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago, I remember going to a training course in a school, in an all Irish school, and there were 20 primary school teachers sitting around the room, and I asked them, what would the answer be to a neachatu a bach ag an deireadh seacht, and did you go out at the weekend? And they all, without exception, they all said huime. And I said, no, it's hue. You don't use the may. You know, you don't need to. It's not proper usage. Um, and they were shocked. They totally disagreed with me. They said, no, this is what we've been taught. this is definitely what we've been taught. Um, but there are many examples of that things that are badly taught in the school system. Anyway, I had the advantage of being able to you know differentiate between what was right and what was wrong.
And I think this is a kind of a fundamental point, really, isn't it? That so much of the language is taught by well, non-native speakers. That's inevitable because of just the population size. But I think by people who have probably quite a limited amount of, you know, learning in the language themselves. I mean, they have done it at a certain level, to degree level, and so this is a I think a massive problem in terms of how the language is learnt by any of those exposed to it for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the focus in education in primary, secondary school, and even third level, there isn't enough focus on everyday usage. There's a tendency in the past, there's a tendency to focus on grammatical rules, taught out of context very often. And even now, there isn't enough focus on what happens when people interact. And therefore, people have a difficulty. Um, they're taught language that's removed from its context. Um, so if you ask, I can guarantee you, if you ask 100 school kids the question in Maithlat, pop do you like pop music? I can guarantee you that a fair percentage of them will say Sha, and fair percentage of them say Ismailum, and it's the actual answer is Ma. Um, so a very, very basic thing that should be taught is the difference between question and answer on the one hand and a statement on the other. So a statement would be Ismail and Popyol. I like pop music, with lum included, Ismail and Popyol. But in the question and answer, Malet Popyol, Isma or Nima. Um, so you know, it surprises me that there that really basic thing is not you know focused. There's not enough focus on that still in the education system.
And how do we how do we reconcile that I mean, because it's like it's like that natural interaction thing. I think it's absolutely, you've put your finger on it there, because it's something that anytime you want to start to have any kind of a natural interaction with somebody, even at a Curtal Cora, or if you go to the Gaeltacht, your ability to do so is, well, first, I've always found extremely limited, without having any of that kind of just those natural things that we talk about when we meet each other, which aren't in school curriculum. How do we balance the need to have the kind of grammatical foundation and the understanding of the technical kind of aspects of the language and how it works, and and losing people in getting into too much kind of detail? I mean, for instance, I remember going back to learn the language. I was a very, very poor student. I mean, you're very self-effacing in your description of your studies, but you certainly, we were on the same wavelength, I think, at that stage. But like when I went back to try to starting to learn Irish again, I say again, I think learning for the first time really properly. But like I wasn't aware of ever having been aware of there being different genders for nouns in Irish. Or, I mean, the ideas of, the broad and slender consonants, and the fact that actually determines how the consonant is pronounced, so that an sh sound is a slender consonant, a slender s, and those kinds of fundamental things about the structure of the language that I never seem to and is it, how do you how do you take people who, without wanting to intimidate people but also give them the basics, how do you suggest that should be approached?
Well, there's this communicative approach to language teaching that's been used widely since the mid 1970s. It developed, by the Council of Europe and others, um, and that's been largely ignored in the Irish language sector. But in that kind of approach, you focus on meaning, and that should be the main focus of your teaching, and enabling people to communicate, and and then you teach grammar, and I believe, you know, we've gone from one extreme to another, where in the past there was too much focus on grammar. Now there's virtually none whatsoever, but there's a happy medium. So in a communicative approach, you focus on meaning, and teaching people useful everyday language that they can employ, in a lot of situations, and then you focus on grammar, but not to the same extent at all. And you teach grammar in the context of the topic that you're dealing with, and you teach it in manageable chunks, and you return to the same grammatical topics, again and again, and you add a new piece every time. So, for example, if you're teaching a class where the focus is on talking about your weekend, well, in that case, you're definitely, if you're talking about last weekend, you're definitely going to have to focus on the past tense, for example. If you have a class where you're talking about your family, you're going to have comparatives. You saw again, you shinne, younger, older. You're going to have to deal with personal numerals such as Bart, Tur, Cahar. And it's a really, really nice approach to teaching the language. People aren't overwhelmed. They're just taught enough to get by to talk about that topic. So, if you're talking about last weekend, you focus on the verbs that would be useful in talking about the weekend, huema, Hanukkah, and so on. And so that's the approach that I've used for many years now. It's I didn't think about this approach. I didn't think it up. It's been used widely in the teaching of language, but as I said, not so much in the teaching of Irish.
And so, Eamon, you having done that, you spent that period teaching in Maynooth, and then you was it from there then you went to UCD?
Yeah, so I would have gone to Maynooth in 1981, and I spent 8 years living in the place, partying, having a good time, and yeah, teaching, but teaching very badly, as I said. Um, and then in the early 90s, I was living in Dublin, but still working in Maynooth on a part-time basis. You must remember that at this stage, uh, there weren't many opportunities available for anybody in the country in the 80s and early 90s. So I continued to teach in the college. Um, I did applied linguistics then, in Trinity College. Um, Slowly became a better teacher. Became a better teacher because of a workshop that I attended around 1992, 93. It was run by a fascinating American woman called Patricia Haslam, and she radically changed over the course of a few hours. She radically changed my whole outlook on teaching, and she introduced this incredible thing called communicative teaching, which I had heard of but hadn't really seen in practice. So I totally changed my approach to teaching, and that influence then. Subsequently, then I left Maynooth. I went to Passage on Condra, taught there for 2 years, and then got an opportunity to work on a TV program. Now you're talking that you mentioned earlier, which was a joint production between RT and BBC, and I was thrown in again at the deep end. No experience at all of writing language courses, no experience of TV, and they said just get on with it, and I did get on with it, and many people actually say that that's my best work, which is kind of depressing because it was my first publication. Um, but it was
You peaked too soon, Eamon.
yeah, it did. Yeah, no, it was very very successful. The book sold many copies. The TV series is still available online and still watched by a lot of people. And then after that, I found myself in UCD in 1996.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then, so I suppose, and that UCC, you sorry, UCD, and then you went on to found Gaelculture, and that's something that I think you've been involved in since around 2005. Is that
Uh-huh.
correct?
Yes,
Or yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
okay,
February
okay.
2005. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and so that is a huge, portion of your life that you've dedicated
Mm.
to as an educationalist, I think, teaching the language, and particularly, I mean, would I be correct in saying Gael Culture's, niche, if you like, is helping people working the public service, improving their Irish with a view to delivering services through Irish? Would that be
Yeah,
fair to
that's
say?
that would be correct. Yeah, I suppose many of the learners these days are abroad, and there are classes available in Gaeltacht's headquarters in Dublin, but also a lot of the teaching is now done online. Particularly, I suppose we started online teaching in 2013, which is 9 years ago, um, and we we found it very, very challenging initially because the technology was not up to it at all. We were using a system called WebEx, and I've been teaching for 40 odd years, and I've only ever sworn once, and that was during class, where WebEx just totally gave up. Um, and much to the class's amusement, I started cursing. Um, but yeah,
I remember doing my early my I think certainly the first couple of courses I did with Girl Culture were on WebEx. I remember, yeah, that
Yeah,
one
so
was
WebEx
the
has
back of that.
improved dramatically because of the pressure they felt due to Zoom being such an easy system to use. But these days, the company caters for people in the public sector, as you said, but also many, many, many different types of learners. And the general language classes are still very, very popular.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so what? So if we're talking about, I mean, what's your sense of the um if you like the state of the language as you find it when you have people coming to you? I mean, let's just look at maybe, let's say, Irish speakers, or people who went through the Irish education system and who are going back to improve or relearn their Irish. What's your sense of that now, in terms of how is that how are people coming out of school? What kind of what's your sense of the Irish that they have from having gone through that process?
Well, I remember meeting a woman who was in her mid 60s, who came during one of the open nights we had in Gaeltacht a few years ago. She was 65, and she hadn't studied Irish since she was 18. Had no contact with the language. Said, "Oh my God, I've forgotten all my Irish." And I said, "Well, let's just try and speak some." Um, and after a few minutes, she became more comfortable and started speaking the language at a very, very high level. So my belief is that people who went through the system, many years ago and up to maybe 10, 15 years ago, um, a lot of them they learned so much, and they've some of them have retained a lot of it. Um, I contrast that with maybe people who are going through the system now. Um, they're just not learning it as much at all. Um, and despite the fact that in the past there was a greater focus on grammar than there's a much greater focus now on speaking the language. I still feel that younger learners struggle more with the language, than people who went through the system in the past. In the past, there was so much to cover, um, and people got a huge amount of input, and a lot of people. didn't manage to learn the language, to gain any sort of mastery of the language at all. But many people did at the same time. Um, Whereas now, yeah, there isn't much input at all. The Leaving Cert has been greatly simplified. Um, the amount of literature covered is tiny, so people aren't getting the same level of input as they would in the past, and they're just learning a lot of things off by heart. um, and yeah, that's what I feel, that speakers in the past, people who did manage to get a mastery of the language, managed to retain that over a great period, great number of years.
And Eamon, tell me, what is, if you like, would you see as the strategic objective with the language from, let's say, an organisation like Gael Culture's perspective? What can we hope to achieve in terms of, progressing the use of the language? I mean, is it because, I mean, you're talking, or at least a lot of the people I think who would be coming to you for training would be working in the public service with the aim of delivering services through Irish. Um, what do you see outside of the education system? What do you see in terms of the how Irish what we can expect to achieve with it?
Yeah, I think there's a high level of interest in the language. You know, in Ireland and internationally. So Gaeltacht there's no doubt about it. It does help people um, gain confidence as speakers of the language, and it has a very, very positive effect. And thousands of people go through this system every year. So it has, and you know, it does, help a cultural change in the public sector. It definitely is helping in that regard. Um, so, you know, when Gerhard started training courses in Dublin City Council, for example, there was only a handful of people who were willing or able to offer service through Irish. And at one stage, that had increased from a few people to over 50. It's much higher now, I'd expect. So that's an example of a changing culture within an organization. So it has, many, many positive, you know, effects. But at the same time, I'm very, very aware of the fact that the language is under pressure as a community language in the Gaeltacht. So you have this situation where the level of interest in the language is growing rapidly outside the Gaeltacht, outside the country. But then something that Gaeltacht has very little impact on, unfortunately, is the state of the language in the Gaeltacht areas, and that's something that really worries me greatly. The fact that the language is in decline, and the likes of Gaeltacht can't address that problem at all. Um, it's really comes down in the end to language planning and the goodwill of the politicians and the government, which is lacking. They're sitting on their hands, and they're allowing the language to disappear from the Gaeltacht areas.
Yeah, because that's something that's feedback that I've had now from a number of different people that we've spoken to here on the show. I mean, is that one person said to me that they had no fear of the language, and the fact that the language certainly has a strong future for various different reasons, but
Mm,
it's the language, as a community language within the
mm.
Gaeltacht, that is what they're most concerned about, and you're saying the same thing here. Um, what what I mean, is that situation salvageable?
Yeah, difficult to say. If things continue as they are, the language will cease to be a community language within a generation or so. Um, so if if you know the if the politicians were really interested in you know addressing this problem, a lot could be done. but the the interest isn't there. There's a lot of you know pretending to address the issue, but really the I suppose the approach being used at the moment is not working at all. Um, so they're giving Údarás Gaeltacht, I think, are giving funding to community groups to engage in language planning. Um, but that's passing the buck as far as I'm concerned. Um, it's asking people who have no background very often in language planning at all to try and save the language as a community language. Um, so that might work in some areas, but as far as I'm aware, it's not proving to be a very successful approach at all. So that's an example of the approach used by government. Um, yes, it's passing the buck, and it's not really addressing the issues at all. Um, for example, the services available to Irish speakers in the Gaeltacht are very limited indeed. Um, I have a relation who had a speech impediment and went to a speech therapist in the Gaeltacht, and he spoke no English. He was only 5, and she spoke no Irish. So that's an example of the type of thing that happens on a regular basis. Um, so that reinforces the view of many speakers of Irish that it's not if the services are not there, if government isn't interested in providing those services, what's the point in speaking the language? Yeah, so I mean, the question of why the language is in decline is very complex. That's only one part of the problem, and there are many others. But it's something very practical that government could do is provide services through Irish, but those services are lacking.
But and that's such a critical point, Eamon, isn't it? Because I mean, for somebody like me, it's it's become an increasingly important part of my life, but it is still just something that is it's a thing of interest that I'm becoming increasingly engaged in. But at the end of the day, it doesn't affect my life and my ability to deal with like critical things like you mentioned there, something as critical as a speech therapy for a young person. Um, and I mean, what would the view of native speakers in the Gaeltacht be of the rest of us are engaged in a kind of a nice pastime, if you like, or maybe some kind of recreational use of the language, and on the other hand, they can't get essential services provided to them. I mean, are we just are we just kidding ourselves in relation to the way the language is being handled, or I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's no great plan um, for the language. There is supposed to be a 20-year strategy introduced by Fianna Fáil over 10 years ago, but nobody really people aren't really aware of the strategy. It's just something. Again, it's pretending to do something, but actually not doing anything. Um, so there's no strategy on the part of government at all, um, and they're just letting the language slip away as a community language, and um, there's no real debate about it either. Very little debate about it. So I find that very distressing. The fact that we have a crisis in the Gaeltacht, but there's no talk about it. But then outside the Gaeltacht, the language is booming. Uh, there are more people studying Irish in third level than ever. Um, there are more people learning the language online internationally than ever. Um, the likes of Éamonn and Donegal and College Corcaine in Kerry have huge numbers of people studying the language with them. So the question is, will the interest still be there if the language is not spoken as community language? I'm not sure. Um, I feel that it will, that the interest will still be there, even when it's not spoken as a community language. But I'm not 100% sure of that.
Yeah, because then it means that I mean, it's because it's a great challenge all the time. I think trying to learn the language, but then our ability to go out and kind of use it in a
Mm,
natural kind of context or whatever is very limited and decreasing. By the way, you mentioned it, but also I think oftentimes I find when I go to the Gaeltacht, and I'm still only very much a learner speaker, but I feel it's almost like an imposition if I try to use the language in the Gaelic, because I know the person on the other side of the counter is thinking, "Oh my God, if he just spoke in English, I might
yeah,
understand what
yeah.
he's saying." And you try to use the language. I mean, I remember I went into a pub in Falcarra, and I ordered. I said, a pint of Guinness Liddahall, and I ended up getting a glass of Guinness, which for anybody listening who's not from Ireland is a half a pint of Guinness, and I wanted a full pint of Guinness, and I was completely unsatisfactory transaction. Now we ended up clearing it up in English, but I still got charged for the glass of Guinness, by the way. But I said to myself, oh my God, if I can't, if its function as a for communication is it doesn't work, then it kind of defeats the purpose of trying to use the language. How do you feel about that? I mean, because if I go into the language if I go into the Gaelic as a learner, should I be expecting native speakers to kind of like put up with my imperfect Irish, or what's the best approach there?
Yeah, I think the experience that you had is a common one. Very often people go into a shop or a pub or whatever in the Gaeltacht and they try and use the language. The person behind the counter often wants to just get on with things, and the you know they want to communicate, and they don't think in terms of should I speak Irish or should I speak English? They just want effective communication. So very often they'll switch to English. Um, but it's the whole thing is very complex, because very often as well, the person working there might have been brought up in the Gaeltacht, but might have been brought up bilingually or through English, and feels when it comes to communication, the language feels very very inadequate. Um, and very often people in the Gaeltacht as well, are not aware of the newly coined vocabulary. They're not aware of it. It's, a lot of new vocabulary is doesn't come into the language in a natural sort of way. It's the language is terminology is coined, um, made up by a terminology committee in Dublin, um, and far from the Gaeltacht. And very often the learner of Irish will learn a lot of that new terminology. Um, the person in the Gaeltacht is far removed from all of that, and uses the English terminology, and they find it very intimidating then to be faced with this terminology that they're not familiar with at all. So the whole issue is very complex.
I completely, and this is something that it strikes me all the time, is the language faces so many challenges around different these different areas. But you mentioned there in terms of the terminology, because this is another thing I remember as a learner, and you become kind of very proud of yourself as a learner, learning these lists of Stórvocl and the vocabulary for various different things, and of course, again, because one of the big challenges I've in the midst of at the moment is I started off, when coming back to the language, deciding to learn the Kaidan, Standard Irish. And I think, I'm not sure, that maybe what Gael Culture teaches, because again you're dealing with the public service and they would be expected, I presume, to work through the
Uh-huh.
Kaidan. Um, but then, of course, when you go to the Gaeltacht, you're either in the Cainúint Ola or Connemara or Cainúint na Moon, and they're three totally different things
Yes.
as opposed to the Kaidan itself. And so I find myself now, I'm back now trying to get more into my kind of local Munster dialect here and to learn more of that. But then I'm finding myself, oh, am I saying Vime or Vias or
Hmm.
Begme or Bed or and so on? And the mind freshen and lesh and how we deal with all that. But I mean, so like, I mean, how do we deal with that? I mean, if let's say as a learner now coming back, would you be recommending somebody to learn in one of the Cainúnty, in one of the dialects, or would you recommend them to start with the Kaidan? How do you see that best approached?
Yeah, well, if you're living far from the Gaeltacht, the best way, I suppose, is to the best approach is to learn the Kaijan first. Um, but a majority of people who learn the language will end up with a mixture of dialects anyway. And the important thing is that they're able to communicate effectively, and that they have the sounds of the language so that they can be easily understood. Um, if you're living in Kerry or Cork or Galway or whatever, if you're near a Gaeltacht area, um, the best approach there is maybe to attend a course. If you go to Colas in Kerry, for example, you're only going to learn Kerry Irish. Um, but I think for a majority of people, you know, I don't think dialects are that important really. Um, I think a majority of people will, myself included. I'm what's described as a deformed native speaker. I've been away from my community for 40 years, and I've picked up sounds and pronunciations that are alien to my area, um, and I think that's fine. I think, but yeah, if you have an opportunity to go to a Gaeltacht area, then it's well worth learning that particular dialect. Yeah, but even if you go to say Éamonn in Donegal, um, the chances are that you might get a teacher from Connemara. Um, so they don't focus so much on dialects. They focus on just enabling people to communicate effectively and to pronounce the language properly so that they can be easily understood.
I think when you mentioned being out of your community for 40 years, and I think it's on your Twitter handle, you have the wonderful word for exile as well. And what's the word for that?
Yeah,
Exoriact, is it, or?
yeah, or Joriat or McCanter Dukish or something like that. Yeah.
Because
Um,
but that word is exoriact is it's associated with tears. Is that the derivation of the word?
Yeah, it seems to be all right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
it's a wonderful word. Um, yeah, it captures. Yeah, I mean that's the beauty of the language. That there are so many words that are so difficult to translate. You know, yeah. So that adds to the richness of the language.
And of course, but this is one of the things I constantly kind of struggle with. I think is trying to, on the one hand, appreciate and get a feel for that richness and the severus of the language, but on the other hand, try to decide where do you start and how do you concentrate on, let's say, if you start with Kaidan, do you stick completely with the Kaidan all the time, or try, because sometimes in a way it can feel like almost having to learn a separate language when you move into some of the different dialects. But Emmett, could you talk to me just about, just you have been out of the community now for 40 years, but you have been working in the Irish language, I suppose, universe throughout that time in education. what does the language look like in your life now? Or has it looked like outside of education? Because you mentioned about services being provided, and that has increased maybe in some of the organisations you've worked with. I mean, do you find your ability to use the language on a regular basis, is that something that's straightforward for you?
Yes, I suppose uh, prior to the pandemic, um, I would have mixed a lot with people. I would have gone to Irish language events on a regular basis. Um, I would have worked in an office on a daily basis with other speakers, um, and I had very few opportunities to speak English um, up until about 2 years ago. So all my friends, most of my friends were Irish speakers. Most of my socializing was done with other Irish speakers. Um, but since the pandemic, the dynamic has changed a lot. Um, so I now work from home all the time. I have regular Zoom meetings through Irish, but my partner is Chinese, uh, and she struggles with English, and she doesn't speak Irish. Um, so I find that I find myself thinking for the first time in my life, thinking in English. Um, Sometimes, and dreaming in English, which is totally a new experience for me. So I suppose the pandemic has changed, my relationship with the language. But I hope now to start socializing again. There are events happening again around Dublin. Also, 2 years ago, I lived in city centre. I now live in Dublin 18, looking out at the mountains here. Um, so, yeah, I suppose I was fortunate for many years to have such opportunities, so many opportunities to use the language. But even now, I'm kind of struggling more than I would have done in the past. But hopefully that will change again soon.
Mm. But and you mentioned that I think you've seen while I mean your experience there in terms of the limited opportunity to use the language in your daily life, and that impact has had that has had for you, and also that those difficulties that are happening within the Gaeltacht, and I suppose one of the reasons why I decided to have this conversation in English is because I think a lot of those um, conversations around the crisis that is in the Gaeltacht and so on, that's not being, we don't hear any conversation about that in the English
We
language
don't.
media as far as I can see.
Mm,
Um, but allied to that then, or at the same time as that, you have this, as you say, explosion of the language, or certainly increase in the learning of the language online and internationally and so on. And talk to me then about how that feeds into, let's say, the introduction of the language as an official language of the European Union, and the kind of government targets now that they were talking about having, I don't know, is it 20% of
20%.
civil service being able to use the
Mm.
language within a certain period. I mean, is there kind of like almost a two stream, language? We have native speakers in the Gaeltacht, and learners who are now coming up to high levels of proficiency who are working in the EU and the public service.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are so many positive things happening, and you mentioned there the Irish becoming an official working language of the EU. Um, and that the effect that has is very positive. It you know there used to be the question asked what's the point of learning Irish, um, but that question isn't asked much anymore because there are many opportunities, um, and there are many jobs available in Irish now, and a lot of organisations, including Gaeltacht, have difficulty finding people because the young people particularly have so many choices. Um, so there are, there are very, very positive things happening, um, but they're separate and away from the situation in the Gaeltacht. Um, so there are many wonderful things happening outside the Gaeltacht. In government, you mentioned the 20% there. Um, so 20% of people who are newly employed by the civil service, public sector, need to be proficient in Irish. Um, so many of these things, are very, very positive. Um, but the problems in the Gaeltacht remain, and they're not being discussed. They're discussed regularly in the Irish language. They're discussed regularly in the online newspaper t-Oideachasóir. You'll find that a lot of their articles, the most read articles, tend to be about the crisis in the Gaeltacht, and um, so yeah, you have these two things happening side by side. The positive things happening outside the Gaeltacht, and the negative things then happening within the Gaeltacht itself. And the lack of debate about these issues in the English language. Yes, the issues are debated in Irish, but not so much in English.
Mm, 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 mm. And I mean, is because one of the things that kind of causes me some I mean, you mentioned just it's a cause of distress for you, and one has to despair when you think about it. But on the other hand, then I mean, we had a kind of the Irish language revival efforts back at the beginning of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and there
Mm,
was a lot of maybe well intentioned, but how effective it might have been. Or it was perhaps too late even at that stage to
mm,
really get into it. But I mean, we have in the century that's passed since then developed much we have much more sophisticated we have a science about linguistics. We know so much more now about how to do this. And why are we not, doing it better now second time around? Or what's the problem in your head?
well, I suppose one of the major problems was from the time the state was founded 100 years ago. Um, there was a lot of the onus was on teachers to revive the language, and the focus was very much on getting school kids to learn the language. Um, but the problem, I think, it was a lost opportunity when the first Dáil, when we became an independent state, had the politicians decided then to communicate in Irish, it would have had a you know massive effect on people's you know Umperchanga language behavior, um, and it would have greatly increased the status of the language. Um, but that didn't happen. That was that's something, a lost opportunity really. Um, and yeah, the the focus of it was very much on uh, the schools. That's where the revival was going to happen. But that hasn't been a success really. You know,
But isn't that the key that you mentioned there? I mean, that this idea of creating Irish, or trying to the prestige language that of the culture. And I mean, I suppose like historically the prestige language of the culture was English. That Irish was the language of poverty, of lack of opportunity,
mm,
of all of that, of starvation and hunger historically.
mm,
And even, I mean, if you even today, I mean, it's in terms of opportunity, ability to get employment or whatever. It's like it's an absolute given that English is going to be required for anybody and of course we don't have any monoglot Irish speakers left at this stage. But I mean, isn't it kind of ironic now that if we have opportunities arising in the language, but you have to be a translator in Brussels, or you're somehow that you don't have opportunities in Irish, or at least from what I hear, that you don't have the language opportunities arising to that extent in the local Gaeltacht areas. That it's isn't there a desperately sad irony in that I mean, while we might be creating opportunities in Irish now, we have them, we still don't have a in it's economic factors in the Gaeltacht, I imagine, that are a large part of what's causing the problems in terms of the dilution of the language there.
Oh yes, I mean, there's been a brain drain for many years from Gaeltacht areas. These opportunities, as you say, exist outside the for the most part, outside the Gaeltacht areas. I mean, some of my friends have returned. Some of my school friends have, one person in particular has that I can think of returned from Australia and Japan before that, and he has moved back to Gweedore. He's working in an Irish language organisation, but there aren't that many opportunities available, um, and again that has a negative impact on people's feelings about the language, the local people. Um, if the opportunities aren't available, what's the point in speaking the language to their kids? I think the Gaeltacht Éireann was set up in the 1960s as the Gaeltacht equivalent of the IDA, and then Údarás na Gaeltachta came subsequently, and they their policy was to provide employment through factories. So they did create quite a number of jobs, but very low status jobs. Um, people in the industrial state in Gweedore working in those factories are earning the minimum wage. So again, you mentioned the fact that Irish is associated with poverty and backwardness, lack of status, and so on. Well, this definitely doesn't help. The fact that the employment provided by Údarás na Gaeltachta sponsored factories is, they're very, very low paying jobs. I believe that the the they should have focused on providing Irish language jobs. For example, I believe that every Gaeltacht area should have um, uh, permanent exhibition. We should have a space where there's a permanent exhibition focusing on the language. Um, you know, center where people have an opportunity to learn the language, and that every Gaeltacht area should have one, that would generate employment. That's where the focus should have been, rather than on low status employment. So that's a very, very fundamental mistake made by Údarás and Gaeltacht before them.
Mm. And is it the case, Éamonn, that I mean I wonder about the seriousness of Irish government policy in relation to the language. Essentially, I mean, like, um, it was kind of like, just let's just stick that into secondary education, or primary and secondary education, and that'll take care of itself
Yes.
over there. That's as much as we need to do from a government
Mm,
point of view. I mean,
yes.
like as far as I'm aware, the official working language status was one which the Irish government resisted kind of tooth and nail for many, many years in terms of relying on a derogation, which they finally had to give up, I think,
Uh-huh.
in January. So it's almost like it was the reason the Irish is a working language of the EU was more because of the EU than because of the Irish government. As far as the impression that I've gotten has been. And I wonder, like, is it, are we serious about it really as a country?
No, I don't think we are, and I don't think politicians have been very serious about it. Over the last few generations, um, there is this, yeah, as I said now, in the Gaeltacht areas, the situation is yeah, yeah, well, local communities are expected to revive the language themselves. um, and yeah, it's a case of passing the buck, and politicians not really being serious about reviving the language at all. Um, so I think um, there's an apathy there, and yeah, I don't think that's going to change soon. You know, um, I wonder if Sinn Féin get into government at some stage. If that'll make a difference, I'm not sure. But Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, there's no great appetite for doing anything radical. Um, and there isn't even an acknowledgement, I don't think, of the crisis in the Gaeltacht. Uh, so, yeah, that's.
And but what do you think of the ordinary Gaeltacht native dweller? I mean, how concerned? I mean, are they about this? Is it something that exercises the I mean, you're very concerned about it. You're somebody who's dedicated your life to the language and teaching it. What do you think the ordinary man or woman on the street in the Gaeltacht thinks about this?
Well, I think that quite a substantial, well, quite a few people in the Gaeltacht would share my concerns about the language. Um, but I suppose the younger generation is apathetic. They they've lost a connection with the past in a way. A lot of them, they look to New York now or to London. Their interest is very much, yeah. They've lost that um, link with the past, with 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 the language, with the culture, with the environment even. Um, the typical teenager now in a Gaeltacht area would sit at home playing playing computer games, um, rather than would be very, unlike myself, would be, when I was growing up, we were out and about a lot. We knew the names of the fields. We knew the names of the rocks even. um, that connection seems to have been lost. The the young people, yeah, they look towards New York, uh, towards their interests in mass culture, and there are exceptions, of course, but a majority of young people in the Gaeltacht now, um, they're not that interested in the language. Another problem is that they the world has changed a lot particularly over the last generation. I mean, 25 years ago, there was very little talk of the internet, for example. Um, the world has changed dramatically. The the language used 30, 40 years ago um, suited the lifestyle of the people in the Gaeltacht. They had all the terminology necessary to talk about their everyday lives, fishing and farming and so on. Um, but that when I was growing up, we were self-sufficient when it came to food. We grew a lot of our own vegetables. We cut our own turf and so on. We had all the terminology to describe that work, um, and uh, the the world has changed a lot, and people have stopped farming in my area anyway, and they the typical conversation in the pub now would be about the Premier League. And I remember sitting in the pub in Gweedore one night and listening to this credible code switching where people talked about very, very trivial everyday things in Irish. But when they started discussing some match that had been played that day in the Premier League, they switched to English. Um, so the part of the problem is that people are lacking the linguistic resources to describe the 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 life that they now lead, which is, a lot of it is online, and you know there's there's so much mass culture now. Um, so that's another problem that's difficult to solve.
And I suppose if I could be devil's advocate for a second, because I have a view on this, but I'd be interested to hear what yours. And why should they care? Young people now, if they're, why do you believe that they should um, care or be interested in making the language relevant for them, or having that connection with their past there?
Yeah, you can't force anybody, um, to you can't force a linguistic choice on somebody. You know, I think it's inevitable in a way. I think that this is happening globally. This is not just a phenomenon that's occurring in the Gaeltacht. It's happening everywhere. With minority languages. Um, so there's huge pressure when there there's a dominant language, when there's a widely spoken language, whether that be Spanish or Chinese or English. Um, when there's a high status language, you know, in competition with a minority language, there's usually only one winner. Um, so I don't blame. I don't look at those young people in the Gaeltacht. I don't blame them. The situation is very complex. Um, we're living in a increasingly, small world, um, where we have access to so much information, um, and so I don't blame people, um, and I believe that it's inevitable that young people in the Gaeltacht will speak English. The situation I would like to see is a higher degree of bilingualism and people, you know, being willing to use both languages. Um, I think that's the best case scenario. Um, you know,
Well, I think that the bilingual case is just unanswerable, and is a really worthy aspiration. I mean, I think it's just such a, I mean, it's as I've heard it described. I think that um, monolingual, or sorry, that multilingualism is the oxygen of culture, whereas monolingualism is the carbon monoxide of culture.
yeah.
Um, and I mean, like, for me, certainly, and I'm not there yet, but the aspiration I have is, because in terms of, when you talk about knowing the names of the fields and the rocks, and on that whole kind of the understanding your environment, and being able to interpret your environment and your sense of place from your locality. But even like it would be extraordinary, I think, if you were to have an English person who was incapable of reading one of Shakespeare's sonnets, you know, in terms of their culture,
Hmm.
and the English language culture now. I mean, to thine own self be true, or there is a tide in the affairs of men. I mean, like, these things that come into the culture in the English language, and they're just terms of reference that we will all be familiar with at some level. And it would be extraordinary for an English person not to have that culture, a direct connection to that culture. But as Irish people, most of us are incapable of having that direct connection to our culture and those, the literature and the oral tradition and so on. And so for me, that's it has to be the prime reason why. But do you think that's a factor for anybody? I mean, because that oral tradition that is there in the Gaeltacht goes back like intact hundreds, maybe over 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something very, very valuable. I think people do see the value as well of being able to tap into the literature and you know the culture, the language.
I mean, you are somebody who has a unique experience in terms of your bringing in as a native Irish speaker, and also then your contribution to Irish learning for so many people nationally and internationally. And as you say, you've covered a period of time where there has been extraordinary changes in society over the period of that career. So you've given us an exceptional and unique insight into what's going on. Not the most rosy of pictures, unfortunately, in terms of the Gaeltacht, but I think that's just the reality that we are faced with. But
Yeah, and I
um,
think it's important to face up to that reality as well, and that debate is lacking in the English language anyway. And I see the language slipping away, and I do find it distressing that there's so little you know discussion of this crisis.
well, thank you for giving us a small insight into that crisis here, and for let's say hopefully starting that discussion, Éamonn, and hopefully it's one that we can return to. Éamonn a chara gur raibh míle maith agat bhfuil mé ansult as an scéal a rainn tú linn berbua agus beannacht a chara.
Gur mí maith agat héine inniu.
Thanks for listening. Gur raibh míle maith agat as a bheith éisteacht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamala.